This week's Parsha of Behar, we have a fairly well-known statement that Hashem says, Ki li v'nei Yisrael avadim. Because the Jewish people are avadim, we'll translate and define that word more clearly in a minute. Avadai heim asher hotzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. They are my avadim, so repetition, whom I have taken out from the land of Egypt. This is said in chapter 25, verse 55. The Jewish people are Hashem's avadim, they are his avadim that he has taken out of Egypt. Now the word eved in legal terminology generally means a slave. In other words, somebody whom you own. So in its most basic sense, what Hashem here is declaring his ownership of the Jewish people. And what supports this explanation of this word, or this interpretation of this word avadim, is the Gemara in Kiddushin, where it speaks about a Jewish slave. You see, what happens is a person who, let's say, becomes extremely impoverished, and to the extent that he actually sells himself as a slave rather than hiring himself out for work, or a person who is guilty of theft, and there are particular conditions attached to his theft, he can't pay back, and what he stole is so valuable that his sale as a slave doesn't fully pay off the value of what he stole. Right, so like robbing a bank or something. He does this kind of theft. He becomes a slave for 6 years. At the end of those 6 years, again, under certain conditions, we're not going into the details today, but at the end of those 6 years, he is set free. However, he has the option to continue in slavery. He can actually say, you know what, I'm very happy with the way my life is now, and I would like to continue as a slave. In that case, the Torah tells us that he is brought to the door, and his ear is pierced. I think somewhere over there, right, with an awl, and he becomes a slave until the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, which is once every 50 years. However long that will be depends on the particular placement of his incident. But the question the Gemara asks is, why is he pierced through the ear? And it answers based on this verse. The ear that heard, Li b'nei Yisrael avadim, the Jewish people are slaves to God. They are slaves to God and not slaves to human beings. And this person, not only that he was forced into servitude, as he was originally either through his theft or through his poverty, but now he desires to extend his servitude, so he is choosing slavery. And the Torah is saying, no, you are not. You didn't listen properly. You are not this guy's slave. You are my Hashem's slave. Now, I've been quite cautious about this translation because I think to be identified as a slave doesn't really make us feel too good about ourselves. Nevertheless, the concept really should, and that's what I want to explain a little more in a little while. Firstly, there's a very nice explanation given by the Maggid of Dubno, that he says, what's the idea of they are my slaves and not slaves to others? So he says, if a person serves Hashem with an awareness that Hashem is his master, if a person really does the mitzvot and does all good things out of a reverence for God who commanded it, then he says such a person is an Eved Hashem, a servant, perhaps as a nicer translation. But then such a person is a servant of God. He says, however, a person who does not do it with those with that kind of background, a person who is not doing mitzvot out of service of God, a person, that such a person, he says, seems not to be Hashem's servant. In such a case, he says, tragedies can befall a person and the Jewish people that they will end up being enslaved or oppressed by another nation. They will indeed become avadim la'avadim, slaves to others. So that's the subtext of this drasha according to the Maggid of Dubno. The Gemara says it in a way of rebuke to the person who chooses another slave. Why would you choose another slave? Don't you realize you are already a servant to God? Whereas the Maggid of Dubno takes it as a warning. You are God's servant. If you do not wish to be God's servant, then you will end up as a servant to somebody else. As Bob Dylan says, you got to serve someone. So that's the first way of looking at it. But Rabbi David Aaron explains this quite differently in terms of what the idea of service actually means. What does it mean to serve? So on the one hand, to serve means to do something for somebody, to help somebody. If I have a servant and they are serving me, that means they're helping me. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to Hashem, because Hashem needs nothing. There's nothing we can do for Hashem. So servant and service clearly doesn't mean that implication of doing something to help somebody. What service means here, rather, Rabbi Aaron explains, is to serve the ideals and the values that God represents, encapsulates, creates, that are identified with Him. You see, when we often have too narrow a definition or a realization of God. If you would ask somebody, where do apples come from? No, they come from the tree. What gives them that power of growth? So you'll say, well, there's the tree and there's the photosynthesis and the roots getting the water and the minerals. But a person who really understands will know that it is the growing power of God that is invested within that tree that ultimately creates this apple. It's an amazing thing. And the truth is that's so with so many things in life. But we don't always think about that in terms of human characteristics, human traits, and human expressions of divinity. When you see one person helping another, one person treating another with decency and kindness. So what response do you have to that? How do you see it? Where does that kindness and goodness come from? So that kindness, that is Hashem's kindness and goodness, that is manifest through the actions of this person. You didn't invent kindness and goodness. It's not something that you've created, but it is something in the same way that the growing power of God is manifest through the tree. The power of God's giving and goodness is manifest through one person helping another. That's one of the things that we mean by service. Are you serving to bring God into the world? Are you acting as a channel for that? Is that your avdut? Is that your avodah? Your work that you are doing? You see, a servant is somebody who doesn't really have an independent identity. He's not somebody who goes around, doing things that are truly his. Whatever a servant does is an expression of the property of his master. Now, in human terms, that's quite demeaning and undermining, but in divine terms, what it means is to be a part of God and to be a part of God's mission. And that, in fact, is the greatest and most liberating thing. Everyone wants to be part of something bigger. Everyone wants to tap in to the greater reality. That is what service means of God. That's what it means, that we are tapping into God's reality, God's wisdom. When we study the Torah, that is God's wisdom. When we do kindness with other people, that's God's kindness. When we show inner strength and discipline and the ability to say no, that is God's strength. All of these things are bringing godliness into the world. And when you have idealistic, passionate, caring atheists, the real problem is that they are misunderstanding and mislabeling. Because somebody who is fighting their entire life to bring peace, they want to bring God's peace. God is the master of peace. Oseh shalom b'mramav. It is God's peace that they are serving, or that they want to serve, to bring into the world. And that, Hashem says, is the greatest privilege that we have, is for us to be free to serve, to be free to channel the values and holiness of godliness into our lives, into the lives of others, into the world. And for a person to give all of that up and go and give up their freedom to act and sublimate their abilities in service of another human being is missing the point. Because the great privilege and honor we've been given is Avadai Haim. We can serve to bring all of the great ideals and values of God into the world. V'lo avadim la'avadim. Don't give that up by serving others instead of God. Shabbat Shalom.